So now we have the initial state, we have that function. What happens inside of the function then? I mentioned that we now have to find out which kind of action was dispatched so that we know how to edit our state. Again, don't get confused that we're not dispatching actions yet. We'll soon add the code to do so. Now, to check different kinds of possible actions, you could add multiple if statements and run different code depending on which action you have, or since you have multiple possible conditions, you can use a switch case statement. And then on the action, you have to check the type of the action. Now, to get better TypeScript support, you can add a type here to the argument, to the action argument, and the type would be action, where action is actually imported, not from this package, but where action is actually imported from @ngrx store. This exports an action interface, and this simply is an interface that forces any action to have a type property, which is why we can safely check it here. So now I'm switching on the action type, and now we can just register different cases. So different action types you want to handle. Now it's totally up to you as a developer of this application which action types your application has. And here we could start with a simple one. If we have a look at the shopping list service, getting doesn't really change the state, but maybe we start with adding an ingredient, because that will change our ingredient's state. It will add a new one. So we could start with a simple state, which we now give an identifier, or type is the identifier, but the value of type is a string. So here we could name this add ingredient. Now it's absolutely up to you what the value here is, but the convention is to use an all uppercase text, which kind of is clear about what this action will do. So here, if I give this action an identifier, a type of add ingredient, it's pretty clear that, well, this action will probably add an ingredient. So add ingredient is the case here. And with that case registered, we now have to do what? If you recall what I said on the slide, we have to return a new state now. So we get the old state and we need to return a new state. Now what you could do is, you could take the state, which has the ingredients property, and then simply use push to add a new ingredient. And that would be totally wrong, because state changes with NGRX always have to be immutable, which means you must not edit the existing or the previous state. It's absolutely forbidden and a bad practice if you do so. So never touch the existing state. Instead, return a new object which will replace the old state, and to not lose all the old data, copy the old state with the spread operator. That is next generation JavaScript syntax, which is also supported by TypeScript. It essentially pulls out all the properties of the old state and adds these properties to this new object. Hence we have a new object with the old data, and hence we have a copy of the old state, and if we now edit this copy, it's okay. So we copied all the old state, and now I want to override the ingredients. So I'll add the ingredients property, and now we can assign a new value to that. Now correctly you would say that the old state was just an object with the ingredients property. So if I copy the entire old state and I then change the ingredients, I essentially don't need to copy it. And indeed you could omit this here because we're changing the only thing this state has. Still, it is a good practice to always copy the old state, because later and in other apps you will certainly have some states that consist of more than one property, and if you then only change one of the properties and you forget to copy the others, you overwrite the old state with the new state where you dumped all the properties you didn't change, and that's not something you want. So rule of thumb, always copy the old state, then overwrite what you want to change. Now ingredients has to be an array, and of course here I don't want to lose my old ingredients. Therefore in this ingredients array, I also again copy my old state ingredients now. So I access the previous state, which we still have here in the state argument, and there I access the ingredients property, which holds this array of ingredients, and the spread operator can also be used on arrays to pull out all the elements. And I then add all these elements I pulled out to this array here. So therefore now the ingredients array is a new array with the old elements in there. Now, side note, the elements themselves are also objects, and I didn't copy those. So here we technically still have the old objects in that array, but we don't change them, so that is fine. What I do change, however, is I do add a new element here. And that would, well, where do I find this? Well, it has to be part of the action somehow, but we don't know yet. So for now, let's just add the entire action object here, even though I can already tell you that this is not the final solution, because this is an object that, for example, has a type property, and ingredient doesn't have a type property, so adding the action is certainly wrong, but it's a first step. Let's next have a look at these actions and see how we actually create and dispatch actions.